It's now time for your Election Crimes Bulletin with Greg Palast.
And this is Dennis Bernstein with Greg Palast. We are live. We're coming at you from San Francisco and Los Angeles, and we are happy to be back. And we're happy to have Greg. He's been out in the field digging and fighting for your vote, and he's got a lot of information that we want to share with you. Mr. Greg Palast, welcome back to Flashpoints. It's been a bit since we've been live, and we are happy to have you back. We know you've been out in the field, and let's get right to it. Let's start off in Georgia with the new purge in Georgia. We've been watching what's been happening there on the ground. So bring us up to speed, Greg.
It never ends. Georgia, of course, they're going to pick your president for you. I hate to tell you, San Francisco Bay Area, you don't count, okay? If you want to fix that, you need a new constitution. But so it'll be up to a few swing states. The swingiest is the state of Georgia, which Donald Trump officially lost by nearly 11,000 votes out of 5 million. But they're going to make sure that that Georgians don't make that mistake again by voting for the president they want. So the Republican Secretary of State, a guy named Brad Raffensperger, that's really his name, with the blessing of the Governor Brian Kemp, have removed this, just the last 2 weeks, 191,473 voters from the voter rolls. Let me repeat that. That's 100. I know, take notes now, 191,473. Now, who are these people who are being kicked off the voter rolls? I mean, you have to, as you know, if you commit a felony crime like murder, then you're going to lose your right to vote in most states. So are these 191,000 murderers? No. They are voters that they say that there's a challenge, that there's a question about their address, or they're inactive voters, whatever that means. And by the way, Voting Rights Act specifically says you can't remove people because they skipped some elections. But that's part of what they're claiming. But they're claiming that now Georgia has the cleanest voter rolls in America. That's a quote from the Secretary of State. Of course, they've bleached the voter rolls whiter than white. We've been here, Dennis, if you've been listening to the Election Crimes Bulletin, it may sound like a repeat show, because in 2020, the same character removed 300,000. I got the best experts in America, including in the Bay Area, Mark Sweedland, who's a listener of this program. Some of the top people work for Google and eBay and the others that know exactly where you live, to see if these were people who don't live at the voting address that they claim, that they're illegal voters. And we found 198,000 voters were removed illegally and wrongly, and not just any voters. Those are numbers. When you're talking removing 100,000 here, 100,000 there, it kind of adds up, Dennis. But who are they? I was at the polling stations, and I met these voters when they were thrown out. One I didn't know was on the list. I had to look her up, named Christine Jordan, 92 years old, in her walker. She's thrown out of the polling station into a storm, was storming out. Her granddaughter in tears. This was Martin Luther King's 92-year-old cousin, who was thrown out of a polling station after voting at the same station for 50 years. They said she didn't live in Atlanta anymore. I went, maybe she's scamming me just because she's Martin Luther King's cousin and she's 92. Scammers come in all shapes and sizes. So I went to her house to confirm that she lived there. Indeed, she did, and that she's been living there a while, because there was a picture of her and King having, her cousin King, having dinner at their dining room table in younger days. And so she was at least in this house half a century. And that's who they're removing. On and on, I could go through endless names, but it was, so once again, it's almost...
Well, and let me just jump in here. For folks who haven't heard the Crimes Bulletin before, who might need a refresher, if you were to listen to, you mentioned Brad Raffensperger, and if you would listen to the mainstream, the corporate networks, you would think he is a hero. He's one of the people who saved the vote for the people. He has been cheered and celebrated, but he's not really a hero, is he?
Well, a lot of people considered Hitler a hero because he was anti-Bolshevik, right? So Brad Raffensperger, who's been played as a hero on 60 Minutes and on many stations, including MSDNC, Raffensperger has been the Purgeon General of Georgia, Republican hitman. He took Brian Kemp's place, who made himself governor by purging the voter rolls of a massive number of black people. And he's played as a hero because they stood up to Donald Trump. They didn't really stand up to Donald Trump. They just didn't want to go to prison because there's a woman right down the street who's basically is going to get every paper and phone call that they have, named Fannie Willis, who's a prosecutor who has something against people trying to undermine democracy and stealing elections because it's a felony crime. It's a felony crime in Georgia. You'd be surprised, but yeah, it's actually a crime in Georgia. It's racketeering to have a conspiracy to overturn an election. And so they wanted to stay out of prison. That doesn't make them heroes. And in fact, they did everything that they could possibly do to get Trump elected. But he blew himself up, and they couldn't carry him over the finish line in Georgia because Georgia is heading into a majority state, as they call it, where white people be in the minority. But the other thing is that in Atlanta, people are progressive. It's a new Georgia, and the old Georgia, and I would like to remind people who've seen my film Vigilante, that the current governor, it was his family which first brought enslaved Africans to Georgia. These people want to prevent, not only, they're building their careers not only on vote suppression, but on hiding the fact, the ugly history of enslavement in Georgia. And why does the governor, like they're on this big anti-CRT campaign, what they call critical race theory, but what they mean is we can't teach history because they don't want to teach about what they did. You notice that I'm mixing the teaching of history with vote suppression because you cannot separate those two. So in Georgia, you've got these basically running this massively racist campaign against voters, knocking off people like King's cousin. And now in this new round, how they find that, by the way, I should mention, this guy Raffensperger went on 60 Minutes, went on MSDNC, went on National Petroleum Radio, and he said, Donald Trump is wrong. There wasn't one single fraudulent voter casting a vote in Georgia. Not one. And yet, wait a minute, but now he's removing 191,000 would-be criminal voters. How does that happen? Because they're not.
I don't know.
According to our expert, these people are there. We go to their houses. We find them. They are voters. They show up to vote. But overwhelmingly, they're using a system called ERIC, and a study done by Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, together determined that ERIC is not only identifies wrongful voters, overwhelmingly, those wrongly identified people are African American, Hispanic, and Asian American. And I was there in places like Wisconsin, which have used this, where I had one student who lost his vote, an Asian American student, because he moved his dorm room. You don't lose your vote because you move a dorm room. But he was unfortunately trying to vote while Asian. And that's how the Republicans in Wisconsin kept their power. That's how the Republicans kept their power in Wisconsin, despite it being really a blue state. And this is how the Republicans of Georgia have kept some of their power. They lost, Senator Warnock was reelected, but only because the voting rights groups, we were able to identify the wrongfully purged voters, get them back on the rolls, and go into federal court. So this is the battle. The reason I focus on Georgia, not only because it's an important swing state, but it's kind of a test kitchen of the vote suppression trickery mostly by the GOP. Not exclusively, but it's mostly GOP.
All right, now I want to continue in Georgia because there's a lot to say about what's going on the ground. You've got a very active district attorney there, a very active prosecutor who is moving ahead despite, I guess, the concerns of some others. But she is, among other things, Fannie Willis, she is an expert in the sort of the kinds of statutes that were used against organized crime. And she's moving ahead no matter what anybody says because she's not easily shoved aside. So tell us a little bit about where her investigation is and why a whole bunch of people are afraid of her.
Well, because she is an expert in what's called racketeering, RICO statutes, with the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act. I was also the RICO expert for the U.S. Justice Department. I respect Fannie Willis very much. She's a tough prosecutor. In fact, a lot of African Americans in Atlanta were not happy because she's a put him in jail, throw away the key, tough law and order lady. But when she had this Agent Orange come into her district and commit and organize a series of crimes, in particular, we've seen this choosing of inducing people, some Republicans in Georgia, to send letters to the National Archives saying that they had won election as electors for President of the United States to choose our president when they weren't even on the ballot. They never ran. Understand, in America, we have this crazy system. In fact, some people don't know, even now don't know the details of how our president is elected. We don't elect presidents. The candidate's name may be on the ballot, but we only elect a slate of electors. Those electors then get together in their state, have a meeting, and send their names, say, we have won election to be members of the Electoral College. They send it to the National Archives. It goes to the vice president, a guy who at the time was named Mike Pence, and then Pence reads off the names of the winners of the Electoral College and their preference for president in a joint meeting of Congress on January 6th of each after each presidential election. And so we know the rest of that story. But the real crime is here. These people literally said, we won election. They weren't even on the ballot. We won election. So that's mail fraud and a conspiracy to commit mail fraud, which is racketeering, which means a lot of years in the hoosegow for those people who planned it. And the question is, did some orange-tinted guy organize this or know about it or authorize this scam, this fraud on the federal government?
You're listening to the Election Crimes Bulletin on Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. We've been doing this with Mr. Greg Palast for about 20 years now, since the steal at 2000. Let's get into the new attack on mail-in ballots.
Okay, so here's another wonderful one. Now remember, there's this guy named Donald Trump who said that mail-in ballots are a fraud. Well, again, the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, who is right-wing as they come, he has said that we couldn't find fraudulent mail-in ballots. In fact, what they did was, in Georgia, they literally hand-counted and reviewed 5 million ballots twice, and they couldn't find a single fraudulent ballot. Yet, we now have a right-wing group. There's a guy, his name is, Vince Espy. Now, you may not know Vince Espy, but he's really an important character because he has demanded that the state turn over to him all 7 million voter signature registration cards. So this guy will have every voter's personal signature that he's demanding that they turn over to him, and he's demanding that they turn over copies of the signatures on the envelope of every single mail-in ballot. Now, why is he doing this? So he can show that signatures don't match. Well, they've already looked for these things, and yet it's strange. They have not, if you fraudulently sign a ballot, and it's not your ballot that you've received in the mail, and you've signed it, you go to prison. And they believe me. Raffensperger and the right wing and Governor Brian Kemp have been looking for these illegal voters. In fact, they themselves claim that there were 1,000, but then when they look, the 1,000 got whittled down to exactly 0. They can't find one. What this guy wants to do is start challenging votes, because Georgia also has something, as you'll find out in the film Vigilante, which you can get from kpfa.org. In Vigilante, any voter, that is, any vigilante voter, self-described vigilante, can challenge another voter's ballot or right to vote. And what they're setting up is to challenge hundreds of thousands of votes. They challenged 250,000 voters in the 2022 election. We were able to stop them from removing that 250,000 voters, mostly voters of color, overwhelmingly voters of color, the color being blue, by the way. And now they're setting up to start challenging the mail-in ballot, saying this signature doesn't match, that signature doesn't match. because they made the claim. In fact, in Texas, for example, they made the claim that the Democratic supervisor of Texas forged 700,000 ballots. I met with him, and I said, I calculated that would take him like somewhat over 1,000 years to do that if he did it full time. So he must have had a lot of co-conspirators. But we can laugh about it. But believe me, this can block people from voting, and you'll meet the voters who were blocked from voting in Vigilante, Georgia's vote suppression hitman. They're preparing to massively attack voters who vote by mail. Until the 2000 election, it's interesting, Dennis, until the 2000 election, mail-in ballots were overwhelmingly sent in by Republicans, and the Republican Party never raised a peep about, these terrible fraudulent mail-in ballots, because they were mostly by Republicans. During COVID, the Democratic Party and the president and people who didn't want to die to vote by getting ill mailed in their ballots. So in the 2020 election, it flipped. Democrats suddenly became the mail-in voters, and suddenly mail-in voting is an inherently fraudulent system, rife with forgery and ballot stuffing, yet they can't, I'm not saying that they can't find many cases. Dennis, I'm saying they haven't found any cases. That's amazing. We have almost 250 million ballots cast in the last 2 years. And they
listen, Greg, I have to interrupt now, but I have to say that I'm not going to be silent. Anybody who knows me, knows the work we do together with Greg, knows how strong we feel about keeping the right to vote open. And Greg, that's why I want to jump. You've been doing some extraordinary new reporting around the attack on the American native vote. Yes. Particularly in Arizona. In the last couple of years, Native Americans have really expanded their attempts to get the groups and the folks in the Native American community voting, participating in elections. They've been disenfranchised for so many years, having had their country stolen, but now they're back. And because they're back, they're being shut down. You want to talk a little bit about your work on that front, Greg? That's new.
As people know, I've been looking at racial vote suppression for over 20 years, and I can tell you from my experience, while it's been bad for the black community, terrible for the Hispanic community, no community has been more under attack than the American Native community, the indigenous community, especially those in reservations and pueblos. And now, it's not coincidental. Two things you have to know about the Native vote. Number one, it's almost entirely Democratic. That makes them a target. Number two, for reasons that only the Lord High can explain, much of America's resources, from oil to coal to uranium to cobalt, you name it, is sitting under indigenous Americans. And so you have to, if you're going to take away their rights to and their control of their resources, you have to take away their vote. And so let me give you two examples. For BBC television, I went to the Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico. And there, the people in the Pueblo, who were overwhelmingly Democrat, but there was a primary in their county, and it's all Democrats. So there was the rich white ruling class, the plantation owners, so to speak, the ranchers, wanted to sell their properties for uranium mining. But the people in the Pueblo did not want to sell their sacred lands for uranium mining, and their interests were not just spiritual. They had a uranium mine before. Their kids got sick, and their fields were destroyed. They couldn't grow a thing. It was poisoned by the runoff and arsenic and other things in the uranium mining and processing. They didn't want uranium mining. So they had a vote, and they were voting to elect anti-uranium mining candidates in the county. And so because they had real problems getting their ballots, because many didn't have official addresses. Under the Patriot Act that George Bush put in, they knew American natives don't have normal addresses, because if those who know, if you're on a res or in the Pueblo, that a lot of the addresses were 1 mile west of the post office, next door to the gas station. Those are the addresses. So under the Patriot Act, you actually have a street address, like 2222 Gas Station Way. So they didn't have that. So they were required to vote provisionally. So they sent in hundreds and hundreds of provisional ballots into the Pueblo. And they said, okay, here's your official ballot. Then we will check that you're a legitimate voter, even though you don't have a normal address. But you have to put them in these official envelopes. So they filled out their ballots. They put them in the official envelopes. And then the white people controlling the county disqualified all their ballots. I mean, all of them. Why? Because they used the wrong envelope. They said, but we used the envelope you gave us. And they said, yeah, but we gave you the wrong envelopes. Ha ha. Gotcha. I'm not making this up. I put this on BBC TV. And again, now I want to point out something. You notice I put in the issue of control of uranium because that's what it's about. It's about control of resources, control of income. It's about power. In other words, as Dennis was telling you at the front end, one thing I'm always saying, vote suppression is class war by other means. It's power, it's resources. They're not stealing votes to steal elections. They're stealing votes to steal the money. Let me go somewhere else. I was just on the Osage Reservation in Oklahoma, and they were telling me they just sent, and then I went out to Arizona because they had sent teams out to the Pascoyaqui Reservation, where the state of Arizona, there was a shock win by Biden of Arizona. That's what, the shock wins of Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada and Wisconsin put Biden into the White House over Trump. Now, how in the world did Biden win Arizona by about 14,000 votes? The answer is the American native vote came in a big surge. That put him over the top, which they didn't expect. Why didn't they expect it? Because, are you ready for this, Dennis? They removed polling stations from the reservation. When I say they removed polling stations, like the Pascoyaqui, they didn't just remove polling stations, they removed all the polling stations. Let me repeat that. All polling stations removed from the reservation. That meant that if you lived on the res and you didn't do a mail-in ballot, you're going to have to drive about 100 miles round trip to vote. And, so the GOP, which put this into place, they're chuckling. Oh, we don't have to worry about the res vote, which is all Democratic, and, unless they want to use up a lot of gas. During COVID, by the way, drive 100 miles, stand in line during COVID. So they were laughing. But then the Osage, who have a little more money than the Yaqui Pascua, they sent in people to help out, make sure they had, Patriot Act-ready voting addresses, got them registered, got the mail-in ballots, made sure that the mail-in ballots were filled out correctly because it's very easy to disqualify a mail-in ballot. You add, in most states, you add a middle initial, but you didn't register with your middle initial. You sign it with your middle initial, they disqualify the ballot. So they really worked on getting these things right. They got tens of thousands of unexpected votes out of the reservations in Arizona. And that's why Biden is your president. So thank you. Next time you see an indigenous American, please shake their hand. And not because they voted for Biden, but because they saved our democracy. Okay?
Amazing.
And they are under attack again. But again, you have to go back to the fight over the resources. So when I'm in Arizona and I'm watching Carrie Lake, who's running now again for U.S. Senate in Arizona, and I hear her talking about the ballots being stuffed into the ballot boxes, into the mail-in, into the drop boxes. Oh, here's the other thing that they did in Arizona to stop Hispanics especially from voting, is they had, again, armed vigilantes standing armed, with their guns out next to voter drop boxes and challenging people on their citizenship because they had darker skin when they approached the drop box. This is the United States of America. This isn't 1820 or 1870 or 1920. This is 2020 and 2022. This is what's going on.
Well,
it's this new vigilante attacks.